Hey everyone, welcome to another AP Environmental Science lecture. Today we're going to look at community and ecology. And we've already looked at factors that determine population size, as well as the ways like models to predict how populations are going to grow or decline. However, that just doesn't determine the size of a population. That doesn't tell us about what determines the distribution of the populations across the planet. So there's two factors that determine whether a species will exist in a location. We saw in earlier lectures that if a species is able to disperse to an area, its ability to persist there depends on the fundamental niche of that species. But the survival of a species in a habitat is also determined by the set of interactions that it has with other species. So what we're going to look at in this lecture is different relationships among species. So we're going to start off by identifying the interactions that cause negative on one or both species, negative effects. Then we're going to look at the positive effects. And then finally, we're going to look at the very important role of a keystone species. So before we get going here, what these are called symbiotic relationships. And all a symbiotic relationship is just a close relationship with two different species living in close proximity to each other. So we're going to start off with the negative ones first. So you can have quite a few different negative species interactions. You can have negative species interactions among members of the same species, among members of different species. And first we'll look at is competition. So you can see the lion or the cheetahs here again between two species competing for food. Same with the lions and these birds fighting over the dead carcass of the zebra. But then it's not just food that you're also going to compete for. Here you have the bighorn sheep competing for a mate. So when there's limited resources, in this case females in a population, you're going to have to compete to reproduce. Or in the case of the lions and the cheetahs, you're going to have to compete to eat. Which brings us to this competition exclusion principle. All this is saying is that two competing species cannot coexist if they're fighting for the same limited resource. One species is going to outperform the other and drive the other to extinction. And we can see this on the right with the parameciums. Here we have the number of individuals of Aurelia growing exponentially, then reaching carrying capacity and staying at a pretty constant 200 individuals when they're by themselves. Same can be said for the Caudatum paramecium, reaching almost 150 individuals and being successful. But you can see when we grow them together that the Aurelia outcompetes the Caudatum, driving it to extinction. So that's basically the competition exclusion principle. So what we see happening is that species are going to start to partition. They're going to start to change their behavior based on that resource that they're fighting for to make things easier for themselves. Perfect example is the desert plants. You have that tar bush. You can see that it has very deep roots that reach deep sources of water, whereas the grama grass on the left has this shallow root system. It'll spread out and will grab water when it falls in the infrequent events in the desert. So here we have, instead of both of them fighting for a resource, they've developed ways to succeed and partition the resource. This can be seen in the warblers as well. Here you have one tree with 5 different birds. Again, they have evolved to coexist in the same tree, but just each one existing in different parts of that tree. And finally, we see it in aquatic marine birds as well. From the flamingo to the plovers, you can see each one has developed a different diet. So again, you don't have 5 birds competing for the same resource. They have enough for each of their own species. Looking at predation now, so you have this predator-prey relationship. So the predators here being the eagle or the bear, the prey being the field mouse and the salmon. So all that's happening is, one, the prey is being killed and consumed by the predator. Moving on to parasitoids, what's going to happen here is they're still considered predators, but what they're doing is they're using a host to almost incubate their eggs, for lack of a better term. So here you have the wasp laying her eggs. The larva will begin to grow and develop, and once it becomes the wasp, will emerge. So again, a parasitoid is just kind of almost this little avenue for the organism to lay its eggs. Through evolution, though, organisms have developed defenses, and it's not always easy for the predator. The predator is not always going to win in this case, and many different prey defenses have evolved over time. We have our camouflage, where you blend in with the environment. Foul smell and a foul taste. Predators don't want to eat things that taste or smell bad, or even just poison if it's going to hurt that organism. And the other cool thing, I think, is the mimicry. So the last three really they don't taste bad, they don't smell bad, but they've mimicked organisms or species that do. So you can see the viceroy butterfly mimics a monarch butterfly. So a predator is not going to take chances on a butterfly that looks like the monarch, knowing that it already doesn't taste so hot. And then even the snake caterpillar, this guy's gone above and beyond, making itself look like a large snake, something that could actually hurt the predator. Another form of symbiotic relationship that negatively affects one is a parasite. And with parasitism, what's happening is one is being harmed. So we have, in this case, a mosquito. You can have ticks. You can have fleas. So again, one is being harmed. The host here is not normally killed. It's just, again, harmed. And the mosquito and the tick, in this case, are being benefited. These are not to be confused with pathogens. Pathogens are parasites, but they're going to cause diseases. So on the right, you have pathogenic diseases in humans, but again, you can have a fungus outbreak in a forest that affects trees. You can have a virus that we saw on Isle Royal, the canine virus that wiped out a lot of the wolves. So these are going to spread disease through a population. It is important to note, though, that one single parasite won't cause death. It's when you have this outbreak of parasites that you'll see individuals start to die off. Believe it or not, there's something called herbivory, where you have an animal consuming a producer. So you have an herbivore consuming plants. It is also essential to point out that they only eat a portion of the producer. They're not killing it. They're getting what they need and they're moving on. There are some negative aspects of herbivory, though, and we've seen this when we talked about the tragedy of the commons. So if the amount of herbivores increases in a certain area, it's going to have dramatic effect on producers. They're not going to be able to bounce back. They're not going to be able to grow in the quantities they did in the past because you had an increased number of these producers. So producers have also evolved defenses. So starting at the bottom left, you have the cacti. Yes, the spines of a cacti, an organism would not want to consume those plants, but also, side note, those are actually the leaves of the cactus. It's another adaptation of living in the desert. Plants lose water through their leaves, so the cactus having tiny spines doesn't allow it to lose as much water as it would should it have leaves. We all know that every rose has its thorn. You wouldn't want to eat something like that. And then finally, they even have developed defenses like, in this case, waxes or even poison ivy, where an organism rubbing up against that would have detrimental effects. Little sidebar, though, if you're ever out, leaves of 3, let them be. So if you see one stalk and 3 leaves coming from it, and sometimes there's a little pinkish, hueish hint on the leaves, that is poison ivy. Had that a few times. No bueno. So we're moving on to the positive aspects now that species will have on each other. And we'll start off with mutualism. What's happening with mutualism is both species are benefiting from this relationship. So in the case of the bee and the flower here, the flower is getting pollinated. Once this bee leaves and flies to another plant in a different area, whereas the bee itself is getting nutrients and food. Here with the alligator, you have the alligator getting its teeth cleaned, and who's going to mess with this bird when it's hanging out inside the mouth of an alligator? So mutualism, both are benefiting. When it gets to commensalism, only one's benefiting. You don't have any harm for the other. It's not helped as well. So in the case of the bottom left here with the bird, it's got its nest in a cactus. Good spot to be for protection. Again, the cactus is not helped nor harmed. And we all know the clownfish and the sea anemone with its stinging tentacles. The clownfish is resistant to that sting, so it's going to hang on the anemone for protection. Great table just to refer back to, maybe screenshot this or come back to it, but it gives you just a quick overview of every type of relationship we've talked about. You got the pluses, you got the minuses, and here we got with commensalism, doesn't matter with species 2, no harm, no benefit. We're going to close out this lecture looking at keystone species. And before we move on, it's important to point out a keystone. So here we have these arches, and if you've ever been in Europe, especially Italy or Rome, you have buildings that have been up for thousands of years, and especially their arches and their aqueducts. And what they called the stone that kept them all together, this arch together, that is called the keystone. You remove that one stone, and this whole arch is going to fall down. So take that idea now in regards to the keystone and how that's where we have these certain species that exist in ecosystems that without them, the entire community will collapse. And a wolf is a perfect example. And they might not be in abundance. There might not be a lot of wolves in this case, but their effects that trickle down are quite amazing. So in the case of the wolf, in the 1920s, they were almost entirely eradicated from Yellowstone. They were listed as endangered. They were brought back in the 90s. And just by looking at these two pictures, you can see how the health of the ecosystem just rebounded tremendously on the right by just adding some wolves. It's amazing the effect that one organism can have. So again, this would be an example of a keystone species. And if you ever get a chance, very short video, this will kind of show you how wolves even affect not just the biotic components of an ecosystem, but the abiotic as well, in this case, rivers. Closing out the chapter, we have these, an engineer builds things. So a keystone species that builds or creates habitats, we call them an ecosystem engineer. The earthworm creates fertile soil and nutrients for other plants to grow, whereas beavers are important species to a community because the role they play in creating a new pond and a wetland habitat. So for a species that is not particularly abundant, the beaver has a strong influence on the presence of other organisms in the community. So that wraps up our lecture on community ecology. Refer back to the website. There's some resources there. You got your notes, and always shoot me an email or come see me if you have any questions.